As the last enemy ship vanished, Cole stood on the bridge of his battered flagship and looked at the debris field that had been a battlefield. The cost had been terrible, with over 100 human ships destroyed and thousands of lives lost, but Earth still stood free, and humanity had proven they could stand against a galactic empire. And when General Stevens contacted him from the command center and told him that long-range sensors showed no additional Krathian forces approaching and it appeared the immediate threat was over, Cole nodded wearily and ordered the fleet to begin search and rescue operations for survivors and to secure the battlefield. President Hayes addressed the world that evening, and her face showed the weight of the losses but also the pride of victory as she spoke about how humanity had faced extinction and refused to surrender, and how they had fought against impossible odds and emerged victorious. She declared that Earth would no longer hide in their own system but would venture out into the galaxy as equals and not as subjects, and they would build alliances with other species who valued freedom and stand against tyranny wherever they found it. In the weeks that followed the battle, humanity's actions echoed across the galaxy as other species learned that the Krathian hegemony had been defeated by a newly emerged race. Some species saw this as an opportunity to resist their own oppressors, while others reached out to establish contact with these fierce humans who had bloodied the nose of a galactic empire. Admiral Cole stood in a cemetery on Earth where they had laid Peter Grant to rest, alongside thousands of other heroes who had given their lives for humanity's freedom, and he placed his hand on the memorial stone and made a silent promise that their sacrifice would never be forgotten and that humanity would build a future worthy of what they had paid. The war with the Krathian hegemony was not over, but the balance had shifted, and humanity had announced their presence to the galaxy, not as victims or subjects, but as warriors who would fight for their right to exist free. And that message would resonate across the stars for generations to come, while Earth stood as a beacon of defiance against tyranny, and proof that even the smallest species could become giants when they refused to bow. In the weeks following the Battle of Earth, humanity transformed, and what had been separate nations became a unified species focused entirely on survival. While President Hayes addressed the world from the newly established United Earth Government headquarters and declared that the age of division was over, and they were no longer Americans or Chinese or Europeans or Africans, but humans who would stand together or fall together. General Stevens was promoted to Supreme Commander of United Earth Forces and coordinated the massive military buildup, while every resource humanity possessed was turned toward one goal, which was preparing for the inevitable return of the Krathian hegemony. Dr. Helen Carter's team worked around the clock and reverse-engineered captured Krathian technology from the debris field left by the battle, and in a secure laboratory beneath the Mojave Desert, she examined a piece of the alien shield generator. With her eyes wide with excitement, she told her assistant, Dr. Ryan Cooper, that this was incredible, because their shield technology operated on principles they had only theorized about, and if they could adapt this to their ships, then Cooper finished her sentence by saying they could level the playing field. Carter ran her hand through her graying hair and said it would take 3 months or maybe 4, and that was working nonstop, because they needed to completely rebuild their understanding of electromagnetic field theory. A voice from the doorway said they had better get started, and Carter turned to see Admiral Cole, who was now appointed as Commander of Fleet Operations, and despite his promotion, he had insisted on keeping his hands dirty with the technical side of the war effort. Carter said she did not expect him there, and Cole replied that he made it a point to visit every research facility at least once a week, because their people were fighting and dying out there, and the least he could do was understand what they were asking them to defend. Carter said quietly that they lost another patrol group yesterday, and the Krathians were probing their outer defenses, while Cole nodded grimly and mentioned the expedition to Proxima Centauri with 15 good people, who took 2 enemy scouts with them before they went down, and every engagement gave them more data and more understanding of how the Krathians fought. On Mars, construction crews worked day and night to expand the shipyards, and Commander Lisa Park had been transferred from the lunar defense batteries to oversee ship production, and she drove her teams with relentless efficiency. She told the shift supervisors at their morning briefing that they needed to triple their output because the Supreme Commander wanted 200 new ships in the next 6 months. Chief Engineer Dale Morrison objected and said that was impossible because they were already running at maximum capacity and they would need more workers and more raw materials and more everything. Park replied sharply that they would get more everything, because the asteroid belt had enough raw materials to build 1,000 fleets, and mining operations were being expanded, and as for workers, every engineering graduate was being assigned to the shipyards, and they would use automation where possible and work shifts where they had to, because impossible was not in their vocabulary anymore. In Earth orbit, new defensive platforms were being constructed, and these were not simple weapon emplacements but fortress stations with each one capable of housing 5,000 personnel and armed with enough firepower to threaten capital ships. Colonel Martin Shaw oversaw the integration of the new shield technology into these platforms, and the first successful test brought cheers from the engineering teams as the shimmering energy barrier deflected a full-power laser strike without even flickering. Shaw reported to General Stevens via secure channel that this changed everything because with these shields, their platforms could stand toe-to-toe with Krethian cruisers. Stevens asked how many they could outfit before the aliens returned, and Shaw said at current production rates maybe 30 platforms, which was enough to create a strong defensive shell around Earth and the Moon. But humanity was not content to simply defend, and Admiral Cole understood that the best defense was a good offense, and he had a plan that terrified everyone who heard it. He explained to the War Council while displaying a star map that they needed to hit the aliens where they lived, and their scout ships had identified what they believed was a Krethian supply depot in the Tau Ceti system about 12 light-years from Earth, and if they could destroy it, they would disrupt their logistics and force them to divert resources. Admiral Karen Price, who was recently promoted to command the Second Fleet, objected that this was deep in enemy territory, and they would be risking their best ships on a raid that might not even succeed. Cole argued that it was a risk, but one worth taking because every day they waited, the aliens were building more ships and training more crews, and they needed to seize the initiative. President Hayes considered this and asked what he was proposing, and Cole said to give him 50 ships and their best crews, and they would jump in and hit the depot hard and fast and jump out before the aliens could respond with major forces. And even if they only destroyed half their supplies, it would buy them months of time. Hayes asked what would happen if he was wrong, and if it was not a supply depot but a fleet base. Cole replied without hesitation that then they would make the aliens pay dearly for every ship they threw at them, and they would buy Earth time with their lives if necessary. The room fell silent, and finally, Hayes nodded and said he had his 50 ships and to make it count. 2 weeks later, Cole's task force assembled at the edge of the solar system, and the fleet included the Washington as its flagship along with cruisers and destroyers and a new class of ship designated as the Striker, which were fast attack vessels designed specifically for hit-and-run operations. Commander Peter Grant, who was now captain of the destroyer, Thunderbolt, contacted Cole before the jump and reported that the fleet was ready, and all ships reported green across the board. Cole told him that was excellent work and signaled all ships that they would jump in 3 minutes, and told Grant that when this was over to remind him to buy him that drink he had been promising for the past 20 years. Grant grinned and said he would hold him to that, and the fleet's faster-than-light drives engaged simultaneously, and 50 ships vanished from normal space. They reappeared in the Tau Ceti system, and what they found exceeded even Cole's worst fears, because the supply depot was there as a massive orbital facility surrounding a moon-sized asteroid, but so was a Krethian fleet of at least 100 ships, with more arriving every few minutes through what appeared to be a permanent faster-than-light gateway. Lieutenant Danny Walsh reported from Tactical, with a tight voice, that it was not a supply depot, but a staging area, and they were massing for a full invasion of Earth. Cole stared at the display, and his mind raced because they were outnumbered 2-to-1 and deep in enemy space, and had just stumbled onto the enemy's main invasion force, and any sane commander would order an immediate retreat. Cole ordered all ships into attack formation Delta, and said they were taking out that gateway because if they could close it, they would strand half the alien force on the wrong side and buy Earth months to prepare. Grant protested that they would never make it through their fleet, but Cole replied that they did not have to go through them, but go around, and told all Striker-class vessels to follow him, while the rest of the fleet would engage the main force and keep them busy because they were going to thread the needle. The human fleet split into 2 groups, and the heavier ships charged directly at the Krethian formation with guns blazing and missiles flying, while the Krethians responded predictably by concentrating their forces to meet what they perceived as the main threat. Meanwhile, Cole led the 20 Striker-class ships on a high-velocity run around the edge of the battle and used the chaos as cover, while the small, fast ships dove through gaps in the Krethian formation and their point defense systems worked overtime to intercept incoming fire. Cole muttered that they were almost there and told the helm to bring them about to attack Vector, while weapons prepared the Nova torpedoes, which were humanity's latest innovation, as nuclear warheads wrapped in exotic matter shells that allowed them to penetrate most known shield configurations, and each striker carried 4. And Cole was about to use all of them. He commanded all strikers to fire on his mark and counted down from 3 to 2 to 1, and then gave the order, and 80 Nova torpedoes streaked toward the faster-than-light gateway, which was a structure of impossible geometry that hurt to look at directly. The Krethians realized the danger too late and tried to intercept the weapons, but there were too many coming too fast. The torpedoes struck almost simultaneously, and the gateway collapsed in a cascade of exotic particles and released energy, and the explosion was visible across the system as a brief second sun that consumed dozens of Krethian ships caught too close to the blast. The Krethian fleet suddenly found themselves torn from faster-than-light travel and scattered across dozens of predetermined coordinates, where humanity's defenses waited with weapons already locked and loaded. The aliens emerged in small groups instead of their planned massive formation and were immediately hammered by concentrated fire from orbital platforms and waiting human ships, while explosions bloomed across the void as surprised Krethian vessels took hits before they could raise shields or organized defensive formations. Cole watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as the trap worked better than they had hoped, and ordered all fleet groups to engage their assigned targets, while the Washington led a squadron of heavy cruisers toward the largest concentration of enemy ships, where 2 of the Krethian dreadnoughts had emerged together. The massive alien vessels were already recovering from the surprise, and their shields flared to life as they returned fire with devastating particle beams that carved through space toward the human forces. The orbital platform designated Fortress 7 took a direct hit, and its shields buckled under the sustained assault, while the station's commander ordered all personnel to evacuation pods as the structure began to break apart. But before the station died, its railguns fired one last salvo that punched through the nearest dreadnought's weakened shields and tore into its hull, while secondary explosions rippled along the alien ship's flank. General Shaw coordinated the defense from his command platform and directed fresh squadrons of fighters to exploit gaps in the enemy formation, while the small agile craft swarmed around larger Krethian vessels like angry hornets, and their missiles sought out weapon emplacements and engine sections. A wing of human bombers led by Captain Nicole Bryant dove through a hail of point defense fire and released their payload of Nova torpedoes directly into a Krethian heavy cruiser's exposed reactor core, and the alien ship vanished in a blinding flash that lit up half the battlefield. The battle became a chaotic swirl of ships and weapons fire as both sides committed everything they had, while humanity's numerical disadvantage was partially offset by the successful ambush and superior coordination. But the Krethians were adapting quickly, and Fleet Commander Korvax aboard his flagship began to rally the scattered alien forces and issue new orders that brought discipline back to their formations. Cole realized the aliens were regrouping faster than expected and told his tactical officer to identify Korvax's flagship, because if they could take out the enemy commander, it might break their cohesion again. Walsh worked his sensors and reported that the flagship appeared to be the largest dreadnought at the center of the reforming enemy battle line, and it was heavily shielded and surrounded by escort vessels. The admiral ordered the fleet to form up on the Washington and told them they were going straight for the enemy flagship in a full assault, because sometimes the only way forward was through. The human ships accelerated toward the heart of the Krethian formation, while their weapons blazed and cut a path through the alien defenses as they advanced. Commander Lisa Park watched the battle from the bridge of the newly commissioned carrier, defiant, and ordered her fighter wings to provide cover for Admiral Cole's assault, while hundreds of small craft launched from her ship's bays and formed a protective screen around the advancing human capital ships. Krethian interceptors rose to meet them, and the space between the two fleets filled with dogfights as pilots on both sides fought with desperate skill. A massive Krethian battlecruiser moved to block the Washington's path, and both ships exchanged fire at point-blank range while their shields flared and sparked under the punishment. Cole ordered emergency power to forward shields and told weapons to target the enemy ship's bridge section with everything they had, and the Washington's main guns fired in a synchronized barrage that overwhelmed the alien vessel's defenses and The battlecruiser's command section exploded in a cascade of atmosphere and debris. But the human flagship did not escape unscathed as a particle beam carved a deep gouge along its port side and breached 3 decks while Cole felt the ship shudder beneath him and damage reports flooded in. He ignored them and kept his focus on the enemy flagship ahead, because they were close now. And if they could reach Korvax, they could end this. The Crethean commander apparently had the same idea about removing opposing leadership because the alien flagship began to concentrate its formidable firepower on the Washington, while beam after beam slammed into the human battleship's shields and drove them closer to failure. Cole ordered all non-essential power redirected to shields and told the helmsman to give them everything the engines had, because they needed to close the distance before their defenses collapsed. Lieutenant Price reported incoming transmission from the Crethean flagship, and Cole told her to put it through while Korvax appeared on screen with what might have been surprise in his alien features. The fleet commander spoke and said that humans were more formidable than the hegemony had anticipated, and they fought with a ferocity that was almost worthy of respect. But they were still going to lose because the Crethean reinforcements were already jumping into the system. Cole smiled coldly and replied that Korvax was right, that they were formidable, and the aliens had made a critical mistake by underestimating them twice. And as for reinforcements, he should look at his sensor readings more carefully. The Crethean commander's eyes widened as his tactical displays updated and showed that the gravity well generators were still active, and any ships attempting to jump into the system were being pulled out of faster than light travel at random, coordinates far from the battle, where automated defense platforms waited to engage them. The admiral continued that the aliens were trapped here with humanity, and they were going to finish this today one way or another, and told Korvax that he should have accepted Earth's refusal and left them alone, because now they were going to teach the entire galaxy what happened when you threatened human freedom. He cut the transmission and ordered all weapons to fire on the enemy flagship. The Washington and Korvax's dreadnought hammered each other with everything they had while both ships were now surrounded by debris and burning wrecks from the massive fleet engagement that raged around them. Cole's ship was hurt badly with multiple hull breaches and failing systems, but the Crethean flagship was in no better shape as human weapons had carved away sections of its armor and exposed critical systems. Dr. Carter, who was monitoring the battle from Earth, suddenly contacted Admiral Cole on an emergency channel and told him she had discovered something critical about the Crethean shield technology, and their generators created a specific resonance frequency, and if they could match it with their own weapons, they could collapse the shields entirely. She transmitted the frequency data to the Washington's weapon systems and told Cole to try firing a sustained beam at exactly that frequency. Cole ordered his weapons officer to reconfigure the ship's secondary laser batteries to match Carter's specifications and target the enemy flagship's shield generators, while the modified beams lanced out and struck the Crethean shields, which began to fluctuate wildly as the resonance effect took hold. Within seconds, the alien shields collapsed completely and left the dreadnought vulnerable. Every human ship in range immediately focused fire on the exposed flagship, and the massive Crethean vessel shuddered under the concentrated assault, while explosions rippled across its hull. Korvax's face appeared one last time on Cole's screen, with the alien commander's bridge burning around him, and he spoke with what the translation matrix rendered as grudging respect, and said that humanity had proven themselves worthy adversaries, and the hegemony had been wrong to treat them as primitive slaves. The fleet commander continued that this battle was lost, but the war would continue, and other hegemony fleets would come, and they would remember that humans were dangerous. Cole replied that they were welcome to try, but they should bring more ships because humanity was just getting started, and they would fight for their freedom against any threat, no matter how powerful. The transmission cut out as the Crethean flagship's power core breached and the massive vessel tore itself apart in a series of catastrophic explosions that consumed nearby ships on both sides. With their commander dead and their flagship destroyed, the remaining Crethean forces began to fall apart, as individual ship captains made their own decisions about whether to continue fighting or retreat. Admiral Price's second fleet, which had been held in reserve, now entered the battle and struck the wavering alien formations from an unexpected angle, while the fresh human ships tipped the balance decisively. One by one, the surviving Crethean vessels activated their faster-than-light drives and fled the system, while leaving behind hundreds of wrecks and thousands of dead from both sides. On the moon base, Tranquility Commander Lisa Park oversaw the activation of humanity's secret weapon, called Project Ragnarok, which consisted of massive railgun emplacements hidden in the lunar regolith and capable of launching payloads at velocities that made conventional kinetic weapons look like thrown rocks. Park ordered a final systems check on all batteries while her engineers worked frantically to bring the weapons online ahead of schedule, and Lieutenant Greg Mason reported that battery 1 through 5 were green, but 6 and 7 needed another 12 hours for power system alignment. And Park muttered that they might not have 12 hours and told them to do what they could. In Earth orbit, Admiral Cole had transferred his flag to the EDS Washington, which was humanity's first true battleship, and the vessel was a monster built in secret over the past 5 years, as humanity's leaders had quietly prepared for the possibility of hostile alien contact. Its armor was layered composite designed to ablate energy weapons, and its weapons bays carried enough firepower to level a continent. While Commander Grant directed Cole's attention to the tactical display and told him he should see something important, Cole studied the readings and felt a chill run down his spine as he asked how many ships were coming, and Grant replied that there were 47 distinct, faster-than-light signatures dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, and they would reach Earth in approximately 6 hours at current acceleration. Cole activated the fleet-wide channel and told all ships that the enemy had arrived in force and they were significantly outnumbered, but had the advantage of fighting for their home. And every ship lost was a tragedy, while every alien ship they destroyed was a victory, and they would make the aliens pay for every inch they advanced and teach them that humanity does not submit, and does not surrender, and does not die quietly. Across the fleet, crews prepared for combat with fighter pilots, climbing into their cockpits, and missile technicians arming warheads and gunners calibrating targeting systems, while humanity's defense force numbered barely 200 ships facing an armada more than 4 times their size. As the Crethean fleet approached, their formation became clear with a massive dreadnought at the center that was easily 10 times the size of the Washington, and surrounding it were heavy cruisers and destroyers and swarms of smaller attack craft. Lieutenant Price reported they were receiving a hail, and Cole ordered it on screen, and a different Crethean appeared this time, who was larger than Vexthar, with scars crisscrossing its carapace and cybernetic enhancements visible along its limbs. The alien announced that it was Fleet Commander Korvax, and that humanity's primitive resistance had forced the hegemony to take notice, and for this insult, their world would not be permitted to surrender, and they would be made an example to any other species that considered defiance, while their cities would burn, and their people would be enslaved, and their planet would be stripped to bedrock. And this was their final warning to evacuate the system, or be annihilated. Cole's expression did not change as he told the fleet commander that he had a message for him and his hegemony, and explained that humanity had faced extinction before, from ice ages to asteroid impacts, to their own foolish wars, and they were still here. And they did not run and did not hide, and sure as hell did not evacuate, and if they wanted Earth, they should come and take it. The Crethean fleet opened fire, and space lit up with energy beams and missile trails, while the human fleet scattered and implemented tactics developed over centuries of naval warfare, but adapted for 3-dimensional space combat. Smaller destroyers and frigates darted between the alien ships and fired kinetic weapons at close range, while larger cruisers engaged in long-range missile duels, and the Washington took a direct hit from a particle beam with its armor sublimating into vapor. But the ship's internal structure held, and Cole barely felt the impact through the inertial dampeners. He ordered them to return fire with all batteries, and the battleship's main railguns fired in sequence with each shot, accelerating a 5-ton tungsten penetrator to 0.8 light speed, and the impacts on the Crethean dreadnought's shields were like small supernovae with brilliant flares that lit up the darkness, while the third shot punched through and tore a 100-meter gash in the alien vessel's hull. Cole directed them to target the engine section to see if they could cripple that monster, but the Cretheans were not the dominant force in the galaxy for nothing, and their fleet adapted quickly by concentrating fire on individual human ships and overwhelming them with superior numbers. The EDS Ranger exploded under sustained bombardment and took 300 crew with it, while the Destiny followed minutes later. And then the Intrepid and Grant reported with a pale face that they were losing ships faster than they could afford. Cole watched the tactical display, and his strategic mind worked through possibilities, because they could not win a straight fight with these numbers, but they did not have to win, and just had to survive long enough. He ordered all ships to fall back to the lunar defense perimeter and execute retreat pattern Delta, while the human fleet began a fighting withdrawal, with ships covering each other as they pulled back toward the moon, and the Krethian forces pursued them while sensing victory, and their formation grew looser as they chased what they thought was a beaten enemy. Cole transmitted on a secure channel to Commander Park and told her that Batteries 6 and 7 be damned and to fire everything she had. And on the lunar surface, massive sections of regolith exploded outward as the railgun emplacements revealed themselves. The magnetic accelerators hummed with power and then fired, and the projectiles were enormous, with each one a solid slug of depleted uranium, the size of a bus, fired at velocities that made the Washington's guns look like toys, and they crossed the distance to the Krethian fleet in seconds, and the aliens had no time to react. The first impact struck a heavy cruiser amidships, and the kinetic energy was so immense that the ship simply ceased to exist and transformed into an expanding cloud of plasma and debris, while the second shot clipped a destroyer and sent it tumbling out of control, and the third and fourth and fifth shots hammered into the dreadnought's already weakened shields. The sixth shot went through, and the massive projectile punched into the dreadnought's core. And for a moment, nothing happened. But then the alien ship's power plant breached, and a miniature sun bloomed in the darkness as the vessel tore itself apart from the inside out. The Krethian fleet's formation dissolved into chaos because they had expected primitive weapons and easy victories, but instead had walked into a prepared killing ground and lost their flagship. Cole ordered all ships to counterattack and hit them while they were disorganized, and the human fleet reversed course and tore into the scattered alien forces with renewed fury, while fighter squadrons swarmed damaged vessels and their missiles, sought out weaknesses in faltering shields, and the Washington led the charge with its guns blazing as it targeted the remaining cruisers. The battle raged for another 3 hours, but the momentum had shifted, and without their command ship and faced with unexpectedly fierce resistance, the Krethian forces began to retreat. One by one, their surviving vessels activated their faster-than-light drives and fled the system, and as the last enemy ship vanished, Cole allowed himself to slump slightly in his command chair, while around him the bridge crew erupted and exhausted. Cheers. Cole requested a damage report, and Grant reported quietly that they lost 23 ships and another 37 were damaged, with 12 critically, while casualties were still being compiled. But preliminary estimates suggested over 8,000 dead. Cole closed his eyes briefly and thought about 8,000 lives and 8,000 families who would never see their loved ones again. But Earth still stood, and humanity still lived. He asked to speak with President Hayes, and when her face appeared on his screen, he could see the weight of leadership in her eyes and the knowledge of what this victory had cost. Hayes congratulated him on the victory, but Cole replied that it was not a victory but a reprieve, because the aliens would be back in greater numbers and angrier than before, and they needed to use whatever time they had to prepare. Hayes agreed, and told him that for now he and his people had earned a moment to breathe and had done well. As the transmission ended, Cole looked out at the stars and at the vast darkness that now held enemies. Humanity had never imagined, and the war had just begun, and he wondered if his species would survive to see its end. Walsh confirmed that the gateway was down, and enemy faster-than-light reinforcements had ceased, while Cole ordered all ships to disengage and prepare for emergency jump. Because they had done what they came to do, the human fleet broke off with their faster-than-light drives charging for the jump back to Earth. But the Krethians were not about to let them escape easily, and enemy ships pursued while firing everything they had. The destroyer Thunderbolt took a direct hit to its engine section, and Grant's face appeared on Cole's screen with static already breaking up the image as he reported calmly that their faster-than-light drive was gone, and they were not making it home. Cole said firmly that they did not leave their people behind and they would take them under tow, but Grant replied that there was no time because the aliens were already on them, and they could buy Cole a few more seconds, and told him to get the fleet home and said that was an order from an old friend. Before Cole could respond, the Thunderbolt turned about and accelerated toward the pursuing Krethian ships, while its remaining weapons blazed as it charged into the enemy formation. And then, its power core went critical and took 3 enemy destroyers with it in a final act of defiance. Cole's jaw clenched as he watched his oldest friend die and ordered all ships to execute jump immediately. And the surviving human vessels vanished, while leaving behind a shocked and scattered Krethian force who had lost their invasion staging. area, and their faster-than-light gateway and their timetable. When the fleet returned to Earth, they were greeted as conquering warriors. But Cole felt no pride, and only the weight of the dead. And he visited Peter Grant's wife, Susan, at their home in Colorado while carrying the message that no military officer ever wanted to deliver. He told her with a voice rough with emotion that Grant died saving Earth, and died a hero, Susan Grant, with tears streaming down her face. Looked at the Admiral with steel in her eyes, and told him to make sure his sacrifice mattered, and to make sure they won. Cole clasped her hand and swore that they would win no matter what it took. 6 months had passed since the raid on Tau Ceti, and Earth had transformed into a fortress, while the orbital defense network now consisted of over 100 armed platforms, with each equipped with the new shield technology and enough firepower to threaten capital ships. The fleet had grown to nearly 500 vessels, though many were smaller corvettes and frigates rather than the heavy cruisers. Humanity really needed. In the Strategic Command Center, General Stevens reviewed the latest intelligence reports with a frown and announced to the assembled military leadership that the aliens were coming, and their long-range sensors had detected a massive fleet buildup in the Epsilon Eridani system, with best estimates putting their force at over 1,000. Ship's Admiral Cole, who had been studying tactical simulations for weeks, nodded grimly and said they were not taking chances this time because that was enough firepower to glass every inhabited world in a dozen systems. President Hayes asked from the main view screen if they could stop them, and Stevens replied honestly that he did not know, because they were better prepared than before, and their technology had improved, and their people were trained and ready, but those numbers were daunting. General Shaw, who now commanded the orbital defense forces, said they needed to change the equation because they could not match the alien ship for ship, so they needed to be smarter. Dr. Carter, who had become an unofficial member of the War Council, spoke up and said her team had been working on something that was risky and completely untested at this scale, but it might give them an edge. She activated a holographic display, showing a complex mathematical model, and explained that they had learned from the Crethian technology that space itself could be manipulated in ways they never imagined, and asked what if they could create localized spatial distortions, which were essentially artificial gravity wells that would pull enemy ships out of faster-than-light travel at predetermined coordinates. Cole leaned forward with interest and said it was like setting traps in space, and Carter confirmed this was exactly right, and explained they could force the aliens to emerge from faster-than-light at points of their choosing, where they would have weapons platforms and fleets positioned to hit them before they could organize. Hayes asked how long to implement this, and Carter replied that the generators were already built, because they had been constructing them in the asteroid belt for the past 3 months, using resources from the mining operations, and they just needed 2 weeks to position them correctly. Hayes ordered them to do it and told General Stevens to prepare their defensive strategy around Carter's gravity traps, while she wanted Admiral Cole to take personal command of the First Fleet, because he was their best tactical mind, and they needed him where the fighting would be thickest. Cole acknowledged the order, and over the next 2 weeks humanity prepared for the coming storm, while families said goodbye to loved ones, heading to the orbital platforms or shipping out with the fleet, and cities held vigils and prayer services, and the world held its breath waiting. On the Mars shipyards, Commander Park oversaw the launch of the last batch of new vessels, including 3 massive carriers designed to deploy fighter wings numbering in the hundreds. Chief Morrison reported while wiping grease from his hands that this was the last of them, and they had given Earth everything they had, while Park looked at the ships departing for Earth orbit and felt a mix of pride and dread and said she just hoped it was enough. The Crethian fleet arrived on a Tuesday and dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system in a display of force meant to intimidate, with over 1,000 ships, including 5 dreadnoughts, and each one larger than anything humanity had ever built. But they did not advance immediately and instead broadcast a message on all frequencies. Fleet Commander Korvax appeared looking even more heavily augmented than before, and began by addressing humans with a voice dripping with contempt, and said they had proven themselves to be unusually stubborn for such a primitive species, and their raid on Tau Ceti was clever, but ultimately meaningless, because the hegemony's power was infinite, and their resistance was futile. He paused to let that sink in and continued that however the Council had authorized him to make a final offer, and if they surrendered now they would be merciful, and 20% of their population would be taken for labor, rather than the total enslavement they had planned, and their world would be allowed to continue existing, though under hegemony governance, but if they refused, they would exterminate their species entirely, and they had 1 hour to respond. The transmission ended, and in the command center the war council gathered for what might be their final meeting. While the weight of the decision pressed on everyone present, Hayes said quietly that 20% meant over 1 billion people, and 1 billion lives they could save by surrendering. Cole countered that it meant 1 billion slaves and the rest of them living under alien oppression and waiting for the day the aliens decided they were more trouble than they were worth and exterminated them anyway, and told the president that they were not offering mercy, but a slower death. General Shaw spoke up and said their people were ready to fight, and every platform, and every ship and every fighter pilot knew what was at stake, and they had chosen to stand. Hayes looked at each of them in turn and saw the same determination reflected in their eyes and finally nodded, and told them to give the aliens their answer while Admiral Cole would prepare to engage the enemy, and Dr. Carter would activate her gravity traps and General Stevens would coordinate the defense. Cole returned to the Washington, which was now upgraded with the latest shield technology and armed with weapons that represented humanity's most advanced engineering, and as he took his seat in the command chair, he activated the fleet-wide channel and told all ships that in a few minutes they were going to send a message to the Crethians and to any other species out there watching, and show them that humanity does not surrender and does not submit, and sure as hell does not go quietly into extinction. He continued that every one of them volunteered to be here, knowing the odds and knowing the stakes, and they were the finest warriors their species had ever produced, and it had been his honor to serve with them, and now they should go teach these aliens why you do not pick a fight with humanity. The Crethian fleet began its advance and moved in a massive formation designed to overwhelm Earth's defenses through sheer numbers. But as they accelerated toward the inner system, Dr. Carter activated the gravity traps and space itself rippled and twisted. Admiral Jackson Cole stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Valiant and watched as the massive alien vessel materialized in the space above Mars. The ship was enormous and dwarfed even humanity's largest orbital stations, and its hull was covered in what appeared to be living metal that pulsed with an eerie purple light. Lieutenant Karen Price reported from the communication station that they were receiving a transmission, and her fingers danced across the holographic interface while Admiral Cole ordered her to put it through. The view screen flickered to life and revealed a creature that seemed to be a combination of insect and reptile, with 4 eyes that rotated independently as it spoke, and the translation matrix rendered its clicking language into English. The alien introduced itself as High Chancellor, Vexthar of the Crethian hegemony, and representative of the Galactic Council of Superior Races, and explained that humanity had been observed for the past solar cycle, and had achieved faster than light travel, and begun to spread beyond their home system, and therefore they were now subject to the laws of the galaxy. Admiral Cole folded his arms across his chest and said they were listening, and the alien continued by explaining that all emerging species must pay tribute to the Council, and that humanity would provide 30% of their raw materials and 20% of their industrial output, and 10,000 of their youth each year to serve in their labor forces. And this was not negotiable, and they had 1 planetary rotation to accept these terms. The transmission ended abruptly and left the bridge in stunned silence while Commander Peter Grant stepped closer to Cole and asked if they could be serious, and Cole replied that they were very serious and told the crew to get him a direct line to Earth Command and prepare a response package for their visitor. Within hours, the Human Council had convened in Geneva, and President Linda Hayes addressed the emergency session with a steady voice, despite the gravity of the situation, and told the assembled leaders from every nation on Earth that they had a decision to make about whether to submit to this empire and become slaves or fight for their freedom. Ambassador Charles Moore from the United Nations stood and suggested that they did not know the aliens' full military capabilities, and perhaps they should negotiate and buy themselves time to prepare. But General Kyle Stevens, who commanded Earth's combined military forces, interjected that these aliens did not come to negotiate but came to dictate, and every analysis they had run on the alien communication suggested they viewed humanity as primitives barely worthy of notice. President Hayes nodded and agreed that their xenopsychology team believed the Crethians operated on a strict, hierarchical system based on strength and dominance, and showing weakness now would only make them more aggressive. Prime Minister Sophie Larson of the European Federation asked what they proposed, and President Hayes said firmly that they would send the aliens their answer and prepare for war. Back on the Valiant Admiral, Cole received his orders and stood before the view screen as his communication officer opened a channel to the Crethian vessel, and Vexthar's image appeared once more, clearly expecting humanity's submission. Cole began by saying that he had consulted with his government regarding their demands and they had prepared their response. And the alien stated, rather than asked that humanity accepted the terms, Admiral Cole replied with a simple no, and explained that they rejected the terms entirely, and that humanity bows to no one, and they had fought for their freedom on their own world for thousands of years, and would not surrender it now to alien tyrants. And if the Galactic Council wanted tribute from Earth, they would have to take it from their cold, dead hands. The aliens' eyes all focused on Cole simultaneously, which indicated extreme surprise or anger, and it hissed, asking how they dared refuse the Council, and stated that their primitive species could not possibly stand against the might of the hegemony, and they had conquered 1,000 worlds and exterminated species more advanced than humanity, and humans were nothing but insects to be crushed beneath their heel. Cole allowed himself a thin smile and told the Chancellor that they were welcome to try, but he should warn them that humanity had a saying about not clawing their way to the top of Earth's food chain to become someone else's prey, and asked if they wanted war because they had just gotten it. The transmission ended and Cole turned to his crew and ordered battle stations and told them to launch all fighters and prepare the missile batteries, and said they should show these aliens what humanity was made of. The Crethian ship began to power up its weapons with energy signatures spiking across every sensor on the Valiant. But humanity had not been idle since achieving spaceflight, and every lesson learned in Earth's countless wars had been adapted for the void. Lieutenant Price reported that the aliens were targeting them with some sort of energy weapon, and Cole ordered evasive maneuvers and told them to return fire with kinetic penetrators to see how their shields handled good old-fashioned mass at relativistic speeds. The Valiant's railguns opened fire and launched tungsten rods at a significant fraction of light speed, and the first volley struck the Crethian ship's shields, which flared brilliantly, but held while the second volley punched through in 3 places and tore into the alien hull. Lieutenant Danny Walsh from Tactical confirmed direct hits and reported that their shields appeared to regenerate, but could not handle sustained fire, and the Crethian ship returned fire with a beam of coherent energy that would have vaporized the Valiant if it had connected, but Cole had anticipated this, and the Earthship was already moving with its fusion drives, pushing it into a hard turn that would have killed an untrained crew under the acceleration Cole commanded them to launch. Missile Package Alpha, and from the Valiant's ventral bays a swarm of missiles erupted into space. But these were not ordinary missiles, as each one had a small artificial intelligence brain that was capable of coordination and tactical thinking. They spread out in a complex pattern, with some racing ahead, while others hung back and created a web of threats that the Crethian point defense systems could not track simultaneously, and the first wave of missiles detonated against the shields and weakened them, while the second wave penetrated and slammed into the hull with nuclear fury, and the Crethian ship shuddered under the assault, with sections of its living metal burning and dying. Lieutenant Price announced with surprise, evident in her voice, that the aliens were retreating. But Cole corrected her and said they were not retreating but regrouping, because they had underestimated humanity and would not make that mistake twice. He ordered them to recall their fighters and prepare for jump, because they needed to get this intelligence back to Earth. And as the Valiant entered faster than light travel and left the wounded Crethian vessel behind, Cole knew this was just the beginning, and the galaxy would learn that humanity was not prey but predators, and they had just announced their presence to the cosmos. The news of Admiral Cole's engagement with the Crethian vessel spread across Earth like wildfire, and in bunkers deep beneath the Swiss Alps, the Strategic Command Center buzzed with activity as military leaders from every nation gathered to assess the situation. General Kyle Stevens stood before a massive holographic display showing the solar system and the known positions of alien forces, and his eyes were hard with the posture of a man who had spent decades preparing for a war he hoped would never come. Stevens began the briefing by explaining that based on Admiral Cole's sensor logs, They were facing an enemy with superior shield technology and energy weapons, but they were vulnerable to sustained kinetic bombardment and appeared to have limited point defense capabilities against swarm tactics. Colonel Martin Shaw, who commanded the Mars Defense Fleet, leaned forward and asked what their strategic assessment was and whether the aliens were coming back, and Stevens replied that they should count on it because the Krethians would not tolerate defiance, and their xenopsychology team believed their entire culture was built on domination hierarchies, and by bloodying their nose, humanity had issued a challenge they could not ignore. President Hayes entered the room, and everyone rose to attention, but she waved them back to their seats and said they did not have time for formalities, and asked General Stevens what their readiness level was. Stevens reported that all Earth Defense Forces were at maximum alert, and they had deployed the entire home fleet in a defensive sphere around Earth and Luna, while Mars Colony had activated its orbital defense platforms and their manufacturing facilities were running triple shifts to produce more ships and weapons. Hayes asked how long before the aliens returned, and Dr. Helen Carter, who headed the Xenotechnology Division, replied that their best estimate was 72 to 96 hours based on the time it would take them to report back to their nearest major fleet base and mobilize a proper invasion force. Hayes nodded grimly and said they had 3 days to prepare for the fight of their lives, and across Earth humanity mobilized like never before, with the old divisions of nation and race and creed falling away in the face of an existential threat, while factories that had produced consumer goods were retooled for war production, and volunteers flooded recruitment centers, though there was nowhere near enough time to train them properly for space combat.